Progress. Progress. That's a word that Raiders fans have wanted to hear for so many years. Those are words that Raiders fans have wanted to utter out of their own mouths for so many years. And I think when you look at what's going on, Raider Nation, you can actually feel confident for the first time in almost a decade and a half now in saying that this organization is making progress. The hiring of Jack Del Rio, at least year number one, looked like a solid move. This was a team that was improved. This was a team that played better. This was a team that was more consistently competitive. I mean, you got to look at it. A team that ended up finishing 7-9. They weren't bringing up the rear in the AFC West, not by a large margin. That was the San Diego Chargers, 7-9. That's not a winning record. That's not a playoff record, but 7-9, third in the AFC West. For a team that has been picking in the top 5 and top 10 consistently year in and year out for over a decade now, now you look at this team entering the 2016 NFL Draft with the number 14th pick in the first round. You got to point to that and you got to say, that's progress. And you know what? You're absolutely right. And at the end of the day, no matter what anybody wants to say, I do feel personally that the league is in a better place when the Raiders are viable, when they are competitive, and at least, if nothing else, relevant. And you're getting to that point now where they are viable, they are somewhat competitive, and they are definitely starting to be relevant. With the size of that Raiders nation, the size of that fan base, that can't be helped but be anything but a good thing for the league in general and for fans as a whole. That's just the way it is. And the way I look at it is there were a lot of things that went well for this organization in 2015. You look at Derek Carr, threw for almost 4,000 yards, 32 touchdowns, only 13 interceptions. I mean, he had some really, really good games. He had some other games that were a bit lacking, but he showed progress. And again, that's the key phrase here, progress. And when you get a guy in his second year to throw for over 30 touchdowns and almost 4,000 yards, you got to look at that as positive progress. And while I'm not ready to fully crown his ass and say he is the future of the Raiders organization fully and completely, you got to feel like a major step in the right direction was taken in year 2 of the Derek Carr experience. Then you look at Latavius Murray, 1,000 yards receiving, the Michael Crabtree signing. I usually love one-year prove-it deals, and Crabtree in his 1 year proved it. I mean, he was, from a lineup sense, the number 1 wide receiver for the Raiders throughout 2015, and frankly, I feel the more consistent performer throughout the course of the season. Now, they've given him a long-term extension, and we'll see how that goes, but they had the cap room. And he brought this guy in for 1 year, and he did everything you needed him to do. And he was a nice compliment to the rookie that you had on the other side, your number 4 overall pick in Amari Cooper, who came into the league right away and was productive right away, over 1,000 yards receiving. He had a bit of a yo-yo season in terms of he had some really, really good games and quite a few stinkers. I'd like to see Cooper be more consistent. But again, a rookie wide receiver coming into the NFL, top 5 pick, getting over 1,000 yards receiving as a rookie, which is a position wide receiver we talk about being one of the more difficult to transition from the college to NFL level at. You got to feel positive about the progress that Cooper made and what could be next in his future going forward. Then you flip to the defensive side of the ball and you look at Khalil Mack. And what more can I say about Khalil Mack? If you followed this channel and me long enough, you know how huge I was on this guy in the lead up to the 2014 NFL Draft. And the Raiders, frankly, got a little bit of luck to go their way. The Houston Texans were morons for taking Jadeveon Clowney. The Cleveland Browns were even bigger morons sitting there at number 4 with a guy like a Khalil Mack on the board. Then, arguably the number 1 guy on the board at that moment, him or Aaron Donald, and they end up trading back to 9. And, of course, they screwed it up because that's what the Browns do. Well, for once, the Raiders didn't sit there and screw the pooch. They didn't sit there and outthink themselves or try to do this. They just got themselves a really goddamn good football player and a defensive building block. You look at Khalil Mack. He ended up being voted All-Pro at 2 different positions this year. If that doesn't speak to his respect level that he's earned already in 2 years around the league, if that doesn't speak to the talent of the player, I don't know what the hell does. And for anybody that ever knocked me for saying that Khalil Mack was a better player than Jadeveon Clowney and was going to prove so in the NFL, may I say, aha, fuck you. I was right. And that's really where I think the turning point came was in that 2014 draft. It started with Khalil Mack and other solid selections as well, but it was Khalil Mack. That's the starting point. And then it's Derek Carr. But it all started there to me because it represented a change and a shift in the philosophy of that Raiders organization. Because let's face it, up to that point in time, Reggie McKenzie was looking like he was in over his head, making a lot of dumb decisions, a lot of dumb choices, both in the draft and free agency. Now it's like Khalil Mack set the Raiders Nation, the Raider universe back in place. And stop the craziness, stop the bullshit. That's the way it looks, at least. I mean, it is. You're talking about a team here that made some improvements on the defensive side of the ball under a defensive-minded head coach like Jack Del Rio. Now, granted, it's still not a great defense, and I don't even know if it's a very good defense. They've got Khalil Mack. No more Charles Woodson. He had a nice last year of his career, a nice swan song, but they've got a lot of other jobbers on that defense, if I may say so, to borrow a wrestling term. They've got a lot of jobbers there. Some okay NFL players, but they've got some definite needs there. But all the while, they still got some improvement out of the defensive unit. They weren't the very worst in the league. They ended up going 7-9, and that's a 4-win improvement from the year before. You talk about a team in 2014, started off the season 0-10, and then went 3-3 the last 6 games. They took that momentum and carried it into 2015 and became a much more viable and competitive team. 7-9, a 4-win improvement. And throw in there quality wins against teams like Denver, and even the loss to Denver earlier in the year. They were very, very competitive, and for a lot of purposes should have won that game if there wasn't a pick 6 in there. And then they beat the Jets, a 10-win team. I mean, there's some things for the Raiders to really hang their hats on. Now, granted, there were some things that didn't go well. They had 9 games where offensively they scored 20 or fewer points, and that's something that's got to be worked on. I mean, you've invested some high picks in guys like Derek Carr, Amari Cooper. You got Latavius Murray, a 1,000-yard rusher. You're now spending big money on Michael Crabtree. You need to get more than 20 points per game each and every single week, and you had 9 weeks where you scored 20 or fewer points. But then they also, on the flip side, defensively, still had those games where they kind of got boat raced a little bit. 6 games where they gave up 30-plus points. I mean, at some point in time, that's got to kind of drop down. You can get away with maybe 1 or 2 of those games in the course of a year. But if you're going to have 6 games where you give up 30-plus points and you don't have a spectacular high-flying offense, it's going to be really hard to break a 500 record even at the NFL level. The defense that struggled against the pass, 26th in the league in passing yards allowed, and 0-4 against the NFC North. You had teams like Detroit and Chicago, frankly, should have been winnable games, and most certainly they both technically were winnable games based off the way the games played out. If the Raiders handle business against those 2 NFC North teams, you're talking about a 9-7 Raiders team, a team in their first year under Jack Del Rio that has a winning record. Man, that does a lot of good for them heading into that offseason, building some momentum going forward into 2016 and beyond. So now we look at what's next for this Raiders franchise. Where do they go from here? Where should their priorities be? Well, number 1 to me is don't rock the boat. I know this is a team that's trying to figure out where the permanent home's going to be. Is it going to be in Oakland still? Is it going to go back to Los Angeles? Are they going to try and shake shit up and go to San Antonio? What I don't want to see happen is this organization get so caught up in the bullshit of the logistics of stadium deals and where they're going to play in the future that it takes away from the organization from a sense of the on-the-field product. That's where the priority has to be. Yeah, sure, that's important, figuring out where you're going to play long-term. Hopefully at some point in time they can get a stadium deal done with Oakland. It's ridiculous that there hasn't been a stadium deal done with Oakland for both sides, frankly. But they cannot rock the boat here. They cannot get too carried away with focusing only on that because they'll take their eye off of the ball, which is the most important thing of all, which is fielding a viable, competitive, winning team, something they haven't done for almost a decade and a half now, something that is very, very close at hand. You've got to use free agency wisely, not sitting there and giving a charity case to Matt Schaub to the tune of double-digit $1 million for a year. No trying to sign a Roger Saffold only for him to fail the physical, and you end up reneging on the deal. You have some cap space. You got to use it wisely, especially on the defensive side of the ball. You could use some talent in the back portion of that defense, but don't go hog wild. Don't go crazy. Don't try to go outbidding everybody from every big name, because that'll put you right back in the same situation you've been trying to dig out of for only a decade. You can use free agency to help plug in some of the holes, but they cannot get too carried away with themselves and overspending for big-name guys, because ultimately it's a mistake. And then in terms of the draft, this is where the emphasis and the priority needs to be. Because 2014 produced, 2015 has produced for them. If you get a Raiders team that can get a 2016 draft class to produce for them, they might be a playoff team as soon as next season, let alone 2017 and beyond, what could possibly happen. And to me, they've got to just look at best player available that makes sense for them, that fits for them. Like in 2014, at that moment in time, to me, Khalil Mack for the Raiders was the best player on the board for them. I had Teddy Bridgewater rated very, very high, obviously, if you remember that. I had Aaron Donald rated as a top 5 prospect in that draft as well. But for me, for what the Raiders needed and what it represented, he was the safest pick, he was the most sensible pick, and he was the best possible pick for them. Now you go to 2015. I know I wasn't as high on Amari Cooper as others were. I understand why I felt that way, but I understand why you guys thought your way too. And now after 1 year, it looks like I was wrong about Amari Cooper. However, let me remind you, part of the thing to me about Amari Cooper was not necessarily that he was the best wide receiver in the draft, because I didn't think he was, and I still don't think he was long term. I don't think that he was the best player on the board at that particular moment, but he was the best player for the Raiders at that moment in time. No gambling on Kevin White's athletic upside. No sitting there and taking Leonard Williams. Amari Cooper was the man because you had Derek Carr. You didn't have the ability to get Winston or Mariota, so you're going to roll with Carr. As a result, you have to help him out, and the best way to help him out is give him a weapon on the outside at wide receiver. And somebody like Amari Cooper made all the sense in the world for this Raiders organization. So 2 straight years, they hit home runs with their first-round picks. You continue to hit home runs with your first-round picks. People aren't going to be joking about the Raiders anymore, that's for damn sure. And they got to follow that approach in 2016. Not worry about what people think are the most pressing needs necessarily. They got to focus on the best player available for them, the best fit for them. In terms of their draft needs, though, I think you start off with the defense. I think you definitely got to get better in that secondary corner. I think most Raider fans would agree, and outside observers would agree, is the number 1 need. DJ Hayden has never shown himself to be much of anything. They just don't have much at the position. And picking at 14, the chances are the Raiders are going to be in a position to draft a quality corner. Is that going to be Vernon Hargraves? Is it going to be Eli Apple? Is it going to be Kendall Fuller? Is it going to be Mackenzie Alexander? I don't know. But there's a very strong possibility that at the 14th pick, unless the Raiders outthink themselves and get too cute, that they're going to be drafting a corner there, and it would probably be the right decision for them, even though I could argue for them going in other places. For example, now that Charles Woodson has officially retired, you need some help in the back end of that secondary at the safety position. You're sitting there at pick 14. If a Jalen Ramsey's there, you dash to the podium. You try to kneecap every team picking from 10 and beyond to try and go up and get Ramsey at number 14. You do everything you can, because, my God, would he be a great difference maker in the back end of that Raiders defense. But they can maybe address that later on in the draft with guys like Von Bell, Jeremy Cash, Darian Thompson, maybe a Miles Killebrew. There are some guys that will make some sense to them throughout the draft, so I don't know that that will be a round 1 priority. I don't know if it makes sense. I think they could use some depth on the defensive line, both at the end and tackle position. Especially from a pass rushing standpoint, you're going to be without Aldon Smith for the majority of the 2016 season. So they could use some edge rush depth and some pass rushing talent, both outside and inside, to help take some of the pressure and burden of expectations and performance off of their super stud Khalil Mack. But offensively, I think they've got some needs too. I still think they need some young depth on the offensive line. And again, where they're picking at number 14, if you've got a guy like either Ronnie Stanley or Taylor Decker there, man, even with some of the corners being there, it would be really, really hard to pass up on one of those offensive tackles. You could maybe a little bit later in the draft be looking at that position instead. Or you could be looking at running back a little bit later on. Like for me, for example, I know people talk about Latavius Murray was good and it's not a need. But if Ezekiel Elliott's there at 14, you take Ezekiel Elliott at 14 and you don't look back. Otherwise, I do think at some point in time it is a position, maybe even in day 3 of the draft, that these guys need to address. My biggest thing for the Raiders is don't get cute. Don't just fall in love with the athleticism and the speed. Look at solid football players that project to be solid, very, very good NFL players. And when you look at where they're picking, especially in round 1 with the 14th pick, I like their position. Because chances are they could get a really good offensive tackle or a really good corner and feel really good that they've hit their 3rd straight home run in the draft. And man, like I said, if the Raiders do that, watch out for this team in the future.